Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing some of my absolute favorite completed fantasy romance series and standalones. Alright guys, so I asked over on my Instagram for content ideas because I am running out of video ideas. So if you guys have any good ones, leave them down in the comments below. But a few of you said Bingeable fantasy romance series, and then a few other people said fantasy romance standalones, so I decided to combine them into one video. So all of these series will be finished. I know there are a lot of people that don't like to start fantasy romance series until the entire series comes out, and I totally understand why. Sometimes it can be such a pain to have to either reread or just try to remember a book that came out 2 years ago. So all the books or series I'm about to talk about are completed, or they are standalone fantasy romances, meaning there is just one book. So I am so excited to talk about these books with you guys. Now, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram, Goodreads, and Patreon, all linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about these books. So starting off with fantasy romance standalones. Now, when I was putting this video together, I immediately thought of Entreat by Draven. Now, this is a Beauty and the Beast reimagining and probably one of the best I've read. I love everything this author writes. I really need to get to more books on her backlist. But anyway, if you're unfamiliar with this story, it's almost like a double romance. So we're following this man who ends up being cursed, and his son is cursed along with him, and they're stuck in this kind of sentient, like, evil castle. And the father turns into a beast, and the son is slowly going to turn into a beast and not be able to leave the castle if he doesn't find true love. So the son ends up going to this town where he meets this very pretty, somewhat naive girl and brings her back to his cursed castle. And now this girl was supposed to be forced into a loveless marriage, so she was all about following this attractive young lord back to his mansion. Unfortunately, her older sister was not about it. So her older sister ends up following her where she meets the lord of the castle, and it's kind of like a romance between the lord, the older sister, and then the younger guy and the younger sister. But it was just so good. The banter back and forth was perfection. And also there's some really good spicy scenes in this book. It's not overly spicy, but the spicy scenes that are in this, they're done well. So overall, if you have not read this yet, the writing is beautiful, the characters are amazing, and like I said, there are more mature characters, which I really appreciate. So highly, highly recommend. And the other standalone that immediately came to mind was Order of the Scorpions by Ivy Asher. I adore this dark white shoes fantasy romance. It is so good, and I never hear people talking about it. I know there is a special edition that's about to release. I'm going to try to get my hands on that because I just love this book so, so much. But in this story, we're following this girl named Offset, and when she wakes up, she is in this prison. She's completely naked, and she has no idea what her name is, where she's come from, or why she is there. So she's then taken to this interrogator who pretty much starts like torturing her and won't really tell her what's going on. Then a bunch of mercenaries go in, they murder her interrogator, but they leave her chained to the floor and are like, sorry, life is brutal, and they leave her. So then years go by, our main character has been sold into this like assassin training camp where she's forced to learn how to kill people, and hopefully she'll be purchased by like a mercenary or assassin guild, and she'll be able to kill enough people to buy her freedom. Well, the people that end up purchasing her are those people that left her chained up a long time ago. So it's her kind of wanting to get revenge on them, but also trying to figure out where she comes from and who she is, and then there's like a romance that happens along the way, and it's so, so good. So please, if you have not read this and you like dark white shoes romance, definitely check trigger warnings, but it is such a good read. And next up, I do have one YA series that I want to talk about, and honestly, I love the first two books in this series, but the last book I kind of hated. That's okay though. So it is Once Upon a Broken Heart. So this is by the same author, Stephanie Garber, that wrote Caraval. And this first book, Once Upon a Broken Heart, is set in this beautiful fairy tale-esque, like whimsical world, and we're following this girl known as Evangeline Fox, and everyone knows in this community you don't make deals with fates. However, her best friend is about to marry her stepsister, and she's had a crush on this guy for so long, so she goes to Fate, Jax of Broken Hearts, and begs him to stop this wedding, and Jax agrees, but he asks for 3 kisses of the men of his choosing in return for granting Evangeline's wish. She agrees, and the story goes from there. So like I said, I love Once Upon a Broken Heart, and the second book, The Ballad of Never After, might be one of my favorite YA fantasy books ever written. There's so much angst and longing, all set in this beautiful backdrop. It's so, so good. Then the third book, this book, unfortunately, A Curse of True Love, I hated. So I can rant about this book all day, but the more I think about it, the angrier I get because there are so many questions left unanswered and it drives me insane. But overall, those first two books are so, so good. So definitely still worth picking up. I just wish this last book was a little bit better. And the rest of the books on this list are all completed adult fantasy romance series. So first up we have To Bleed a Crystal Bloom, which is the first book in a 3-book trilogy by Sarah A. Parker, who's the same author that wrote When the Moon Hatched, which is my top read of this year. It is so unbelievably good. If you have not picked it up yet, please check it out. But To Bleed a Crystal Bloom is a very loose Rapunzel. It was influenced by the Rapunzel tale, I'll give it that. But we are following this guy who ends up traveling through these woods, and he finds this girl who is the lone survivor of this horrible massacre. I'm talking this little girl is just surrounded by dead bodies. So he ends up deciding to bring her home and raise her as his ward and keep her completely isolated in his tower, or like his mansion, and all he asks in return is a drop of her blood every night, and we have no idea why or what he is doing with said blood. And the story goes from there. So I will say the best part about this book is you have no idea what is going on, but in the best way possible. You're kind of discovering this castle and all the mystery surrounding this castle with the main character, who is unbelievably naive at the start of this. And as she kind of understands and like realizes what is going on, it just becomes insane. So, like I said, I love this first book. I definitely have to do a reread before I start the second book to snap a silver stem. But overall, I know I'm going to love this series. So definitely check this out if you haven't yet. And next up we have a Flesh and Bone series by Harper L. Woods, the first book being What Lies Beyond the Veil. So I actually have a full spoiler-free book review for this book that is really old. It was when I was doing singular book reviews that I'll leave in the cards and in the description. Super old video, so it's a little cringy, but it'll give you a good idea of what this book is about. But we're essentially following this girl that lives in this very patriarchal society. And in this society, there are people that are chosen to be sacrificed to this veil. And when you're sacrificed to the veil, you kind of keep the veil running, and this veil protects the humans from the Fae. Well, our main character, after not agreeing to a marriage proposal by a horrible person, is then selected to be the one sacrificed to this veil. And when she is about to be sacrificed, the veil ends up rupturing and all of the Fae come spilling out, and they start marking people to take back with them as assumed like slaves. So our main character ends up fleeing for her life. Unfortunately, she is marked, and she finds another marked one, and together they are trying to kind of stay safe from both the Fae and humans that are now hunting them, because humans, if they see someone with a mark, they assume that they are bad and are like killing them. So it goes from there. I loved book 1 and 2. Book 3 was a lot in terms of, I can't even say what it was because it'll give a spoiler away, but book 3 I didn't love as much, and I never read the last book. But overall, I've heard really good things about the conclusion of this series, so I'm very excited to continue. My TBR, it's so, so long, but I will eventually continue with this series because I did love the romance in this. It was very reminiscent of like From Blood and Ash, and I loved it. So overall, if you're looking for a completed fantasy romance series with the Fae, look no further. And next up is Curse of Shadows and Thorns by L.J. Andrews. So this is quite a long fantasy romance series. I know Carrie from Book for Romance adores this series. I have not finished it. I only read the first 2 books, and then I moved on to The Ever King and became completely hooked with that duology by the same author. But this is following a girl who I believe her uncle is king and her father is like very sickly, and her uncle ends up forcing our main character to have this like marriage, it's not a marriage trial, but essentially he's promised her hand in marriage. So she has to see all of these different suitors, and the person in charge of like introducing her to these suitors is this guy named Legion. And Legion and our main character end up having a little bit of a romance, and the story goes from there. And there's so much more to it than that, but that's like the main gist of the first book. And overall, I did really enjoy it. I just really wanted to get to the Ever King, and I ended up kind of pushing it off. So I will go back to this series, probably not until the fall, but like I said, I've heard really good things, and it is a completed fantasy romance series. And next up we have A Kingdom of Stars and Shadows by Renee. This is a super spicy fantasy romance series. This story is following a girl that was born with this birthmark that designated her as having very strong blood for the Fae. So when she is born, her mother promises that she will marry the Prince of the Fae, thereby giving him her blood. Now, when she comes of age, she is forced to go to the Fae lands, and although she does not want to do this, she's kind of resigned to her fate until she meets the brother of the prince and has a little bit of entanglement with him, and the story goes from there. So I loved the overall story, and I was really interested to see where this was going. However, the second half of this book really becomes super spicy, and it really doesn't enhance the plot in any way, and I'm one of those people that I like my fantasy romance to be really drawn out, really slow burn, so that way when they finally get together, I'm like, yes, that doesn't happen here. They're getting together like super soon. But overall, I did really like the second book in this series. I still have to read the third book, but I've heard very mixed things, so I probably will continue eventually, but once again, another series that's on my TBR. And this next trilogy is so beloved, and honestly, I might pick it up again soon. I read the first two books. I never read the last book, if you're noticing a trend that tends to happen, but I've just been in the mood for this type of story. So it is Daughter of No Worlds, and this is by Carissa Broadbent. This is actually the first Carissa Broadbent book I ever read. So there are 3 books. They are all super chunky. I will say this series is a little bit more, I don't want to say it's more fantasy than fantasy romance, because there is a romance at the heart of this story. It just has so many more like political and world building elements than the previous books I talked about. But overall, this is following Tasana, and when she was very young, she was taken and forced to perform this like performative magic, and she is hoping that one day she'll be able to buy her freedom. However, when she goes to do this, her master refuses, and there's an altercation. She is able to escape, and she goes to this like magical government order and asks for their help to save her people. Now, they deny her, but they say if she can train up and become an order member, that maybe they'll be able to help her. So she trains under this guy who, the best way I can describe him, is General Mustang from Full Metal Alchemist. And it's their romance, but also so much more. There's also this weapon that is so terrifying that is introduced in this book. And overall, it's a very, very solid read. So, like I said, I didn't love the romance in this just because it's very like, I don't want to say friends to lovers, but it just doesn't have any of that like super enemies to lovers angst that I love. But overall, I will be picking this up again soon. If you've read this series, let me know, what did you rate it overall? And so many people absolutely adore these books, so check it out if you haven't yet. And that brings us to my favorite Why Choose fantasy romance series. We have The Bond Set Tie by Bree. So I feel like my issue with Why Choose is sometimes we aren't given enough time with each potential love interest that I start to confuse them. That is not the case with this series. There's almost a book dedicated to every love interest, and I just love them all so, so much. If you are unfamiliar with The Bond Set Tie, I guess it's kind of like urban fantasy. We're following this girl that lives in a world where some family units are comprised of bonds, and if you have bonds, you are ultra powerful. So the bonds actually help power you up. So Oleander's mother has, I think, 2 bonds, and when she's younger, she's driving in a car with her mother, and her mother's bonded, and there's a terrible accident. So then Oleander, after the accident, instead of going back to her eventual bonded, because she knows who they are, she runs away, which makes her bonded very upset. So they spend the next few years trying to hunt her down, and eventually they find her and bring her back, and the story goes from there. Now, I will say this first book is a little bit of a bully romance because the bonds are honestly heartbroken that their bonded just left them, and they're kind of grappling with all of those emotions. But as it progresses, once it becomes like a real bonded unit, it is so good. So, like I said, one of my absolute favorites, and please pick this up if you haven't yet. And next up is an adult fantasy romance duology. We have A King So Cold by Ella Fields. I love this author so much. She actually just released a new duology, but it's not available in audiobook yet. But as soon as that audiobook drops, I am reading it. So this one is probably my favorite by her. So in this story, we are following this queen, and at the start of her story, the queen is known as being very merciless, and there is an enemy army that is about to invade her territory. Along with that, at the very beginning of this, she is notified that her husband has been found. However, he has no memory that he is the king of this area, or that he even has a wife who happens to be queen. So really throughout this book, we are finding out what caused our main character to become the evil queen she is and why all of these people are frightened by her and how she ended up in this predicament and also why her husband doesn't like remember her. So it's really like a villain origin story and it's so well done and just I love it. There's also a little bit of a love triangle, but so good. And then the second book, I will say, feels a lot more fantasy heavy and also is a lot darker. So check trigger warnings, but overall it is one of my favorite fantasy romance duets. And next up is Lady of Darkness. Now, I have not finished this series. However, this first book was amazing. At the time I read this first book, there were no other audiobooks available. Since then, I'm pretty sure all of the audiobooks have released and this series is finished. Now, I've had so many people say this is their favorite fantasy romance series at the moment, so I am very excited to continue. But this is following a girl along with her two sisters. They were all adopted by the Assassin Lord. And I'm sorry, they're not biological sisters, but these three orphans were found and adopted by the Assassin Lord and taught how to be amazing killers. So they're feared by essentially everyone. After our main character does something that does not please the Assassin Lord, he forces her to stay at this kingdom where she's essentially in timeout. So the Assassin Lord ends up saying, if you can kill your next mark, I will let you out of your like timeout castle. And in doing so, she finds out that there are children that are going missing. So our main character is trying to solve this mystery, also trying to figure out who her mark is and take him down. And while all this is going on, there's this new guy that shows up at the castle she is staying in, and she starts to have a little bit of an attraction towards him, and he kind of starts getting in the middle of everything that she is trying to do. And it goes from there. So overall, like I said, love this first book. It also kind of reminded me of From Blood and Ash a little bit, and I'm very excited to continue. And last up is Wolfsong, which is the first book in the Green Creek series, which is technically a completed paranormal series. However, I wanted to include it because this first book is one of my favorite werewolf romances of all time. It is an shifter romance, and it is so emotional, and just anything TJ Klune writes, I end up crying. But this story is following a boy, I'm pretty sure his name's Gordo. It's been so long since I read this. And he has been told his entire life he's not going to get shit out of life. And he just grows up to be kind of down on his luck. And one day when he's a teenager, he's walking home and he runs into this little 10-year-old boy who tells him he smells like sunshine and rainbows and candy canes and takes him home to meet his family. And that is where our main character discovers that little 10-year-old boy is actually going to be the next alpha of a werewolf clan, and his entire family is werewolves, and it's their romance, and it's so good. So good. So I've only read the first two books. However, I will definitely be continuing with this series, and everyone I know who has read this series has loved all of the books. So if you like shifter romances and you want to cry, highly recommend Wolfsong. Alright guys, those are some of my favorite bingeable fantasy romance series. Please let me know down in the comments below what is your favorite completed or standalone fantasy romance. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to my Paladin Protectors, Amanda, Erin, Leslie, and Kat. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. And I'd also like to say a huge thank you to everyone who has watched this video. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!